Before we start, notice that this video is a part 2 to an alternate history scenario. Part 1 is on a channel called The Cooper Chronicles, who I'm doing a collaboration with. The link to his channel and part 1 will be in the description. I'm not going to explain part 1 to you, I'll just start off from where Cooper left off, as I want you to watch it on his channel. If you don't watch part 1 before watching this, then good luck understanding this video. Anyway, on with the video. It's the 1920s, and Europe is divided between the German Central Powers and the growing British-led socialist bloc. In the mid-20s, due to post-war trauma, Italy and eventually Greece would go socialist. The German government becomes uneasy about the rising number of socialists at their doorstep and begin heavily militarizing on both their east and west border. Japan also would use the time in the 1920s and 30s to expand in Asia and invade China. Meanwhile, the US and the British Empire just kind of sit around and complain about their economic problems. The Great Depression would still hit in 1929, but this time would be much more harsh and devastating on the world. By the 1930s, Europe would begin to shake again with political tension and the increasing likelihood of a Second World War between the Central Powers and the Socialist Bloc, and Japan and possibly even the British Empire. Due to the instability that comes with joining the First World War and losing, the Spanish Civil War breaks out. Socialist Britain and France send heavy amounts of support and aid to the Spanish socialists, while the Spanish nationalists are supported by the Germans. Unfortunately for the Germans, the socialists win and Spain becomes communist and joins the socialist bloc. In 1938, war would eventually break out between these factions. It's unclear how the war would start and who would start it, so let's just assume it starts on similar lines to how it began in our timeline. As usual, the German Empire would invade socialist France and would capitulate it pretty quickly. Later on in the war, they would also invade communist Russia in a more successful Operation Barbarossa. Japan would use this war to gain the opportunity to invade most of the rest of China, Southeast Asia, and the Russian East Siberia. There would also be a large three-way African front between Socialist France, the German Empire, and the British Empire. The British Imperial Army would be able to successfully hold off the Germans in a stalemate and even gain some land in certain places, while French West Africa would soon fall to the Germans. France and Russia wouldn't survive this war, neither would Italy or Greece, and the socialist bloc would basically become irrelevant, causing communist Britain to surrender and pull out of the war by around 1942. A newly independent India would most likely stay neutral in this alternate timeline. The US would be mainly isolationist in this war, and with Japan too preoccupied with Russia, they wouldn't suffer an attack on Pearl Harbor. The war would pretty much end in a stalemate, with little to no progress being made in Africa, a German invasion of Britain being unlikely, Japan running out of people to conquer, and the socialist bloc practically gone. And so in 1944, a peace is signed with the German Central Powers, the British Empire, and Japan being the de facto winners. Russia would split into three between Japan, Germany, and the neutral buffer state in the middle. Pro-German governments would be installed in France, Italy, and Greece. The British Empire would gain a bit more land in Africa. Japan could keep their colonies, and the rest of China would become a puppet state. The short-lived communist Spanish government would be toppled, and communist Britain would basically be told to just kind of sit down and shut up. The 1950s in our timeline was full of technological advancement, extended foreign relations, and international cooperation, excluding the US and the USSR. However, this alternate 1950s would be a time of isolation and national self-interest. The German Empire would probably still invent the atom bomb during peacetime somewhere in the late 1940s to early 1950s. However, it would be looked upon with more skepticism, with some people thinking the splitting of the atom to be a hoax. Even still, with the German invention of the bomb, military technology would still begin to progress, and naturally this would probably also lead to the adoption of nuclear energy to power cities and towns, like in our timeline, with the only difference being that it would probably be less common and looked upon as more experimental and new. The US would mostly just sink deeper into isolationism in the 1950s and wouldn't be as much as a superpower like they were. This would mean that the British Empire, and especially the German Empire, would remain the dominant forces on the globe for a long time. Communist Britain would go down a much, much darker route after the end of the war. With pretty much no allies left, they would completely cut themselves off from the world and would go full-on 1984 totalitarian. They would basically become a European version of North Korea. The British Empire could eventually exploit this de-escalation to plan an eventual full-scale invasion and retaking of the British Isles sometime in the 60s or 70s. The Japanese Empire would stand strong in Asia for a while, but as the 1960s roll around, many of their puppets and colonies would begin calling for independence, to which the Japanese would respond with violence and ferocity. This would eventually lead to rebellion across the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. The British Empire would try to hold on to their colonies harder and for much longer until they could return to the mainland. Entering the 1970s, the world would be in a place of uncertainty and unrest. I'm not sure if there would be a Cold War between the German and British Empire or not. What I do know is that the world would be a significantly more technologically behind place than in our timeline, due to the lack of nuclear energy use outside of Germany, and overall the lack of motivation to develop new military technology. Overall, this world would be a much grimmer and sadder place than in our timeline. That's where I'm going to end this part of the scenario. Thank you for watching, please comment and subscribe, and if you have time, go check out Cooper's channel and subscribe to him. I'll leave his channel link in the description. See ya!